Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. My name is Marissa Maldonado and I'm here with Sovereign. I have invited Larry Smith to join us to present. It's the Hijacked Brain, the family edition. And so he will be doing an overview of the work that he's done with patients and families in treatment. First, before I get started to introduce Larry, I wanted to just give an overview of Sovereign's programs. If you're not familiar, Sovereign is, we're a behavioral health care organization, and we have 3 different programs. We do treatment for mental health, dual diagnosis, and eating disorders, and we treat adult males and females, 18 years and older. And we have now 4 locations for treatment. We are located in San Clemente, which is our location here, Lake Elsinore, Lake Arrowhead, and Culver City. We just recently opened a day treatment program and an intensive outpatient program offering our mental health and dual diagnosis programs. So we are growing, we're expanding, and we are also doing wonderful work with insurances. So we accept PPO and HMO insurances to bring patients into treatment, and we work with families and help them in every way we can to get their family members and loved ones into treatment. So if following the presentation, if anybody is interested in setting up a tour, please see me. We would love to show you around and our facilities. Also, if you haven't already done so, put your business card in for the raffle. We are doing an iPod Shuffle raffle today, which will be at the very end. And then also, if you haven't already, we are putting marketing materials from the other attendees who are from other treatment centers out in the front, so you can grab some information about the other programs. All right, so Larry, I just want to thank you for joining us. And if many of you know that we did have a presenter, Mary Gordon, who was lined up to come present. She was from the Betty Ford Center to speak on family treatment. She did have something come up, so she was unable to make it, and Larry came in and saved the day. And last week he came in, and I'm so grateful that he's here to do this. So, Larry, he is a retired Air Force officer and fighter pilot. He is presently a 747 pilot for United Airlines and has accumulated over 20,000 hours of flight time. He's on staff as a counselor at Sovereign Health of California and is a co-owner of Get Real Recovery. His articles are published monthly in Serene Scene magazine and Recovery View online publications. He works with the United Airlines Employees Assistance Program, guiding pilots with addiction issues through a rigorous recertification process. And his book, Captain Larry Smith's Daily Life Plan Journal, is endorsed by TV's Dr. Drew, who states, Larry created a means to maximize the potential of journaling to engender boundaries, goals, and spirituality. Today's presentation is titled Reclaiming Your Hijacked Brain, the Family Edition. So please join me in welcoming Larry Smith.
My theme song. The local United Airlines pilot for possession of drugs. Police tell 13 Action News they raided this man, Larry Smith's Sylvania Township home last night. They say they found 5 to 6 grams of crack cocaine, cocaine powder, and other drug paraphernalia. Smith was arraigned this morning in Sylvania, then taken to the Lucas County Jail. 13 Action News is working on this story. We'll have complete coverage tonight on 13 Action.
Okay, that's how I got here. That was a pretty bad week for me. They had 21 local news segments on me in Toledo, Ohio. They were doing things like going to the airport, interviewing people getting on airplanes and going, what do you think about your pilots doing cocaine or smoking crack? Now, and the words came out like he's disgusting. And my only thing I can say in defense is no one found me more disgusting than I found myself. And the truth is that it just didn't make any sense. I had a successful aviation career. I retired from the Air Force, honorable, discharged, did well there for 23 years. I was a real estate broker in the community. I was a licensed security advisor in the community. I belonged to Rotary. I dressed up once in a while, went to church. I had two good, healthy sons, loving parents, 3 sisters that loved me. And so, how did I get there? that was my question when I finally got out of jail and went to treatment. On the outside, I looked good. On the inside, I hated myself. I couldn't look in the mirror without like punching myself in the face and calling myself vulgar names. And I ended up, instead of going to prison, I ended up going to treatment in Southern California, went to Cornerstone. I was not a model client when I went through their program. You can trust me on that one. And the counselors there would say the same. But I had a really excellent counselor who, believe it or not, I just talked to on the phone yesterday. I've stayed friends with him all these years. But I loved what he did sitting in those rooms, in those recovery rooms, and talking really directly to people. And it made me want to do what he was doing. And believe it or not, about 3 years later, I was sitting in his chair in the same room, in that same garage in Tustin, doing groups after I became an alcohol and drug counselor. But I still wanted to know, what happens to people? How do people end up, laying naked on their kitchen floor with a shotgun to their head? And that was the first recollection that maybe I had a real serious problem. I actually looked up at the cop and said, "I'm glad you're here." But everything pointed towards the brain. Everything in addiction pointed towards the brain, and everything in recovery pointed towards spirituality. So I've tried to become a student of both. And I'm telling you, the more I learn, realize I don't know. And in fact, this weekend, Lori and I are spending the weekend up in Irvine doing like 17 hours of A Course in Miracles with Marianne Williamson. So, I continually work on it. This presentation is derived from about a 3.5-hour workshop that actually is turning into an 8-hour workshop by February, because that's when I got to have it done by. And so I've taken just kind of the highlights of what I do there. And so this kind of highlights of what I've learned. And so I started out with, this is the topics we're going to cover. We're going to talk a little bit about the passive brain versus the active mind, neuroplasticity and how that's relevant in recovery, the electrical chemical hijacking that takes place in the brain during drug use, alcohol use, love and sex, obsessive thinking, codependency, all kinds of disorders. And then I'll talk some about deceptive brain messages and cognitive distortion, and that applies to everybody. And if we have time, I'll talk about EEG neurofeedback, biofeedback for the brain. But I want to make sure I spend enough time talking about reclaiming the brain and different approaches to recovery. So why do we have brains? Anybody? What's the main function of our brain? Because the sea squirt doesn't always have a brain. I'm going to leave that off. Movement. Most of us, usually I get the answer of thinking. So every brain function has to do with the driver suppression of future movements. We're talking about contraction of muscles, including speech, everything I'm doing up here. And we now have computers that can outthink us. The best computers out there can beat the best guys on Jeopardy, or they can beat the world champion chess players. But movement, a 5-year-old can actually maneuver the pieces on a chessboard better than the best robot that they've ever come up with. So movement is really a big part of what we're doing. And by the way, the sea squirt, it moves around the ocean until it finds a rock to plant itself on. As soon as it plants itself on the rock, it eats its brain. Wow. And then it never has to move again. It's something like tenure with college professors. They get somewhere and they stay, and they never have to move again. Okay, your brain versus your mind. This is how the book called You're Not Your Brain. The brain is passive. Basically, it's 3.5 pounds of water and fat, a little bit of protein, and there's some chemicals in there too. And if you squeeze all the water out, it's, you've got less than a pound of matter. It really does anything. And it's passive. The mind's active, and it spends its time focusing attention on and making decisions that are involved with conscious experience and intelligent thought. Common attributes to the mind include perception, reason, imagination, memory, emotion, attention, and the capacity for communication. What it means is the brain receives inputs from the 5 senses and automatically processes the data into our conscious awareness. The mind is the result of all this electrical chemical activity going on in the brain, and in the brain's neurocircuitry, and it's very complex. The mind has the ability to determine what information to focus on and to consider long-term value-based approaches to action. The mind has the ability to make decisions. This is where we talk about it in recovery. We talk about the third step in recovery, made a decision, right? So the decision to change is what we're talking about overall in recovery. So it takes major changes in one's life to conquer addiction, to modify self-destructive habits and behaviors, and to reprogram the deceptive brain messages that create cognitive distortion. This is the part that's minimized too much in people's recovery. I've been working with people and sponsoring people and working in this field, and I'm kind of a dual winner because I love the AA side, but I love the cognitive behavioral therapy side too. I love both of them. They work together. They seem to want to fight with each other, but there's really no sense in that because we're all after the same goal here, right? And but people don't recognize what it talked about in the first step, the powerlessness that people have over addiction. And they tend to minimize it, and they tend to think they're fixed way ahead of time, and they're not. And that comes up, and that happens in the family, with family members too. Okay, so I talk a little bit about just pleasure versus happiness for just the reason is that why do humans experience pleasure? The Dalai Lama says that what brings you pleasure does not bring you happiness. It took me a long time to actually interpolate that in my own life, but it actually is true. Our brains are wired to ensure that we repeat life-sustaining activities, which, by associating it with pleasure, food and sex, right? That's the most common things. We have to eat, we have to nourish our bodies to be able to live. And we have to have sex, or nobody makes little babies, and then the human race stops. So we all love little babies, so keep having sex. Whenever the reward circuit that produces pleasure is activated, the brain knows, hey, this is important, it should be remembered, and the reward system teaches us to do it again and again without thinking about it. Well, what's that sound like? Well, with addictive drugs, we stimulate those same circuits, and we learn to abuse drugs in the same way we learn to eat food or to have sexual desires. It goes way beyond alcohol and drugs too, because we talk about gambling, shopping, anger, chaos. We talk about some people anger. Anger is something I associate a lot with. Sometimes I'm not happy if I'm not pissed off. Right? It triggers something in me. It just triggers a sense of familiarity. That's what I grew up under. So it's a lot of reprogram going on to take care of it. So the difference is pleasure a temporary experience with either positive or negative consequence. We're going to have great consequences out of pleasure, and we're going to have some really negative consequences out of pleasure. Yeah, okay. And happiness equates to well-being and carries a deep sense of fulfillment. Happiness is a result of overcoming pain and adversity. Now, the big book AA talks about, in every case, pain is the price of admission to a new life. Emotional pain, physical pain, pain of looking at yourself, that's what they're talking about. What's neuroplasticity? Anybody watch PBS and watch Dr. Amon's at all? He talks about neuroplasticity is kind of the first place I heard about this, about 6 or 7 years ago watching PBS. And it's the brain's ability to adapt and grow. And it's the lifelong ability of the brain to reorganize neural pathways, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, based on new experiences. As we acquire new knowledge, skills, and habits, good or bad, we create and reinforce neural pathways. We also call those neural circuits. And just think of them as highways in the brain for right now. Also, neuroplasticity is like if somebody becomes blind and they lose their occipital lobe, the function in there, does that just dry up and go away and not, no, the occipital lobe, if a person goes blind, it will start compensating in the parietal lobe, which has to do with movement. It has a lot to do with the temporal lobe, which is on the side of the brain, which increases their hearing. So they have more dexterity. The cerebellum, it picks up more physical mental dexterity. So the brain quickly compensates for other areas in the brain that are lacking. That's what happens to a lot of these guys coming back from the war. They're partially part of their brain's totally missing. But before long, they can train them to get back to almost 100% of who they were before they had part of their brain taken away. Okay, so what's plasticity have to do with recovery? To recover from the hopeless state of mind created by addiction, depression, and anxiety, there must be persistent functional changes in the brain precipitated by new and repeated thought processes and self-enhancing behaviors. These changes create new neural pathways in the brain. Okay, this is back to where I went back to change. We made that decision to change. We have to change in recovery, or we just go back to doing the same things we did before. Plasticity starts in the womb, okay? When's learning start? In the womb, because plasticity has to do with learning. So babies learn a lot in the womb. So actually, I think of a baby's brain in the womb as is creating the major interstate highways in the brain. These green roads going across there, you know, I-10 going across this way, I-5 going north and south, and you know, and the numbers obviously increase going north and south and going east. And so I think of the baby comes out of the womb, and it has the interstate highways in its brain. And as it starts learning, especially in those first 5 years in development, it starts growing roads off of those highways, and then streets, and then bicycle paths, and then sidewalks, and in our whole life, we just keep creating new neural circuits in our brain. And the good news is we can't create too many. So we start, how are the highways in the brain created? Well, it all starts with brain cells, specifically a neuron. You have 100 billion neurons. When I started studying the brain, like, you know, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, they said we only had 40 billion. I don't know, I guess people have just got a lot smarter, or they have a better way of counting billions of neurons at a time. But 30 million of them set on a pinhead. So that kind of gives you an idea. Now we have 10 times as many glial cells as we do neurons. Anybody ever heard of glials? How many heard of glials? Because sometimes I get none. You know, yeah, so the people with advanced degrees, they've heard of glial cells. They used to kind of think they were just, you know, they have a really bad public relation department because they don't get any credit for anything. And the neurons, yeah, man, we're the big guys, you know. It's like the pilots in the airline, yeah, watch us. But hell, the airplanes don't move without the thousands and thousands of other people that, you know, fix them and put fuel in them and put the food on them and all that stuff. So yeah, the glios, they feed the neurons, they take away the dead parts, and they also have done a lot of studies now. They're finding out that glios are one of the problems with people that have pain, that have phantom pain, that the glial cells are actually generating that phantom pain. And they're learning that they're much more important than they used to. I actually had somebody in my family, one of my family groups here one time that knew so much about glios, I just had her take over for about 5 minutes, and yeah, we all learned something. Okay, so the brain communicates when one neuron talks to another neuron. It's that easy. And what happens when they talk to each other, there's a chemical exchange, and we call that a firing. When neurons fire together, they wire together. Thus, they create highways in the brain. Now, there is a spelling error up here. That is not Hepp's law, it's Hebb's law. So where's Marissa? So you missed one. The first page, you know, I had the family addition. I spelled addition, A-D-D-I-T-O-N, and she called me the other day and said, "Did you really mean that to be addition, or do you want addition?" So thank you. Okay, typical neuron. So here's what kind of a typical neuron looks like. Okay. These are the dendrites, and on the dendrites, there's up to 10,000 receptors on each of these cells. Okay, so there's receptors here, and once they take on a chemical from another cell, it creates an electrical impulse. Now, this is called the axon, and this is just a shaft that the senders are on, and it's covered with like a mucus lining called myelin, and so this cell takes on chemicals, it processes it on down here, and then it sends chemicals on to the next cell. And I'm going to show you a little bit more of this. Okay, in the center here, that's where the DNA is, and all these little blue dots, thousands and thousands of proteins in each cell. That's the nucleus of the cell. Now, there's a lot of misnomers about brain cells. They think they die and they come and go. You have some brain cells from the time you're born till the time you die. And instead of brain cells actually dying with drug abuse or alcohol use, actually it's the dendrites that die And then the glials take out the dendrites and get rid of them through the limbic system.
Is that the pruning?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Okay, so there's one-way electrical thing for each neuron. So, and the chemicals we're talking about there are the neurotransmitters. And so talk about that. Now, what I do, and especially in my presentations, you know, instead of trying to break down hormones and endorphins and neuromodulators and neuropeptides and neurotransmitters and all the different things, chemicals. Just think of them as chemical molecules, unless you're going to be doing brain surgery, and then get the advanced version. So chemical molecules that transfer between neurons. And dopamine is the main one. Now, does anybody know why dopamine is the one that we talk about most with chemical addiction?
Affects the mood.
It affects so does serotonin with that. It's pleasure.
Oh.
Dopamine is associated with pleasure. It does increase the mood too also. But dopamine, every addictive drug releases dopamine in the brain. Okay, and it all starts in the same area, the ventral tegmental area, which we're going to talk about a little later, which is a little primitive area in the bottom of the midbrain. Remember, the midbrain is the reptile brain. The 4 F's, like Dr. Macaulay says, fight or flight, feeding, and fornicating. It's the go system of the brain, right? Then the frontal lobe up here, that's what kind of distinguishes us from other mammals in that 40% of our brain is frontal lobe, and that's our moral conscience. That's our ability to plan. That's our ability to think. Our ability to communicate is all, you know, originated in the frontal lobe. Okay, so dopamine's linked to pleasure, sexual desires. Okay, and all addictive drugs cause dopamine to release in the ventral tegmental area. Serotonin has to do with mood, and they're very similar, actually. Appetite, sleep regulation produces a calming effect. Norepinephrine, fight or flight. That's what I was just talking about. That's released as a neurotransmitter in the brain to release glucose into the system to give you a big rush to go off and do something. Also, it's a stress hormone, so it's considered both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. So we talk about that a lot. Endorphins. Now, we have our brain's own opiates, our own brain's heroin, sometimes they say. And it's endogenous opioids. Endogenous means they're within the brain. And they reduce pain and appetite. And the brain's really smart about how they release endorphins. Say you're out in the woods and you're walking along having a wonderful time, and you see a bear over there, and he's about 300 yards from you, and your car's about 300 yards this way. Now this bear has little cubs around her, so you know she's not happy that you're there. And she growls and she starts towards you. Now what are you going to do? You're going to fight? Nah, of course not. We're going to flight. Or you can freeze and be eaten. So you turn around and you start running to your car, and you're just keeping up. It's looking pretty good, and you trip over a log and you break your foot, and there's a bone comes splinter right out of your foot. Do you feel pain right then? Hell no, because the brain goes, you know what? It's more important that we save your life right now than you feel pain, because pain's just a warning that something's wrong. So you just keep running to your car with the bone sticking out, and you get to the car and you get in, you close the door, and the bear's beating on the car, and you're driving away, and pretty soon you flip that old baby off, and you get down the road, and you go, got away from him. Then what happens? Holy crap, my foot. Look at my foot. So, you know, the brain's really smart about releasing these endorphins. But what happens when we shoot up heroin? Take OxyContin, Norco, Vicodin. These guys, they don't release. They say, okay, you've got your own, keep them. And then what happens when you decide you want to quit your heroin? These guys are like spoiled, or they're like a pissed off spouse. They go, you know what, you didn't want me before, you ain't gonna have me now. And you can feel pain all you want, just suffer. And that's why people with heroin addictions and opiate addictions have such a tough time, because it takes a long time for the brain starts regulating properly to release endorphins on its own. It takes, I sponsored a doctor in AA and he's got 5 years now, but the first year, I couldn't even stand to see the phone ring, because he called me up and says, I feel awful. I'm just doing everything in the whole world. Everybody's picking on him. My man, he's just crying like a little baby. You know, and I wouldn't even answer the phone and go, okay, I gotta get myself in the right mindset to call this guy back. Well, now I love it when the phone rings and he doesn't call near as much anymore because he doesn't have anything to complain about because he's finally got his life back. But it's taken years. You know, and it was kind of, I had to see him gradually taper off and get healthier and healthier. Now his brain's regulating. He doesn't talk about missing his drugs anymore. You know, he still complains about his wife and his kids, but, you know, that he can live with. So acetylchlorine, that has to do with alertness and promoting learning. Notable mentions, glutamate, that excites neurons, has something to do with memory, carrying memory back and forth from the hippocampus. And GABA, which is gamma-aminobutyric acid, it inhibits neurons. And it's also released a lot with alcohol use. And so one of the things happens with alcohol use, you release GABA, and you become very uninhibited. And with me, something made me think I was a lot bigger than I was because I was always getting in bar fights. And obviously, look at my size, it was not something that was good for me. GABA also has to do with sleepiness. And oh, I'm really going through the water today. So people that get drunk and fall asleep, they're probably releasing a lot of GABA. Okay, so here's where the magic takes place. This is where I get excited. So right up till now, it's been pretty boring. And so here's the electrical charge is coming down the axon from one neuron. That was the right side of the neuron that we had up there. And it gets to the point where these little vesicles that store the molecules are. In this case, we'll call it dopamine. And if it triggers enough, if the electrical signal is strong enough, it releases the dopamine into the synapse. Now, the synapse is 3.5 nanometers. Anybody know what a nanometer is? It's very small. It's a billionth of an inch. So 3.5, if my math is correct, and somebody can check me on it, it's 260 millionth of an inch. So it floats around in there. Now, has anything happened since you released dopamine into the synapse? No. No. This guy, the dendrite, he has to take him in. And as soon as it metabolizes in the dendrite, guess what happens? We feel pleasure. So if you're eating a good meal, you're having sex, you're holding hands with your sweetheart on the beach, and everything's just hunky-dory, and the dog's being good, not pooping all over the place today, you're just releasing dopamine, and you're feeling really good, right? And that's kind of normal. That's what it's supposed to do. Now, what happens when you light up that crystal meth pipe and you see these people on TV? I love watching those shows. I don't know why but you know, they get that glass, it's a whole ritual, and they drop that big chunk of crap in there, and then they light it and they smoke it, and you see them go, whew. Are they releasing the same amount of dopamine as, you know, walking on the beach with your sweetheart? No. Truckloads more. I remember the first time I smoked crack cocaine, I was in a bathtub in a Red Roof Inn with some of my best friends and drug dealers and pimps. And they convinced me to take a hit off the crack pipe. And I remember saying, I feel sorry for people that don't get to feel this good. And I meant that. And I thought, and what's really cool is that I'm so special, I can do this without any consequences. I really believe that. Okay. So, what happens, though, obviously? What happens with the dopamine? Over time, we deplete the dopamine. I found that out. I started studying this a little bit before I was still getting high. And I said, oh, I'm depleted my dopamine. I need to get more. And somebody says, well, if you drink a lot of milk, you'll replace your dopamine. And then when I researched it, I found out it took like 23 gallons a day to replace any amount of dopamine. So I quit doing that. And then there was a drug called L-Dopa. That replenishes dopamine. Have you ever gone to your family doctor and said, I'd like to get some L-Dopa? Well, I did. And he goes, what in the hell's going on with you? Thank God he was an alcoholic and he didn't recognize all the signs of addiction because he was in denial about his own alcoholism. Okay. So, okay, now these red balls I told you were dopamine. Now I used to have another slide with blue balls, but everybody kept laughing when I said that. So I don't say that anymore. I just use the same slide, and we have red balls. I don't know why they were laughing about the blue balls, but we have red balls. We're going to call them serotonin. So we come down here. It releases some serotonin in here, and they float around for a while. But what happens with people who need to be in SSRIs, people who are depressed? This guy doesn't want it. He doesn't want those little balls of of serotonin. So they float around here for a while, and then these cells, what they do, and it works actually for almost all neurotransmitters, if they don't get taken in by the dendrite, they get sucked back in to the center. So what do we do with SSRIs, specific serotonin reuptake inhibitors? The molecule released in here, and when it tries to go back in here, there's a little pump that takes it back in, and SSRI shuts down that pump, and instead of getting taken back, it floats in here longer, and hopefully this guy will eventually take it. Why I say hopefully is we don't know how long it's going to take it. That's why we don't know how to really, prescribe SSRIs. So it's always hit and miss. What size dosage? Which one should we use? And that's up to those real smart people that write the prescriptions. Except some of them aren't as smart as others. And that's all I have to say about that. So, yeah, we've talked about that enough. Okay, here's kind of like when one neuron connects with another. Right here is a terminal. That's another word for synapse. And so that's actually a neurocircuit. Two of them connected together. Some of our neurocircuits in our brain are just two. Some of our neurocircuits in our brain, the highways in our brains, are millions connected together. And they connect together. The more they fire together, the more they wire together, right? I keep saying that. Here's kind of where they fire together more. Okay, so when I got ready to write my book, because I wanted to write a book to impress everybody, I don't know, I kept learning so much stuff here. I kept saying, I don't think other people know this stuff either. So I was trying to get it and write it. But the thing is, the problem is, by the time it got published, I'd learned like 10 times more. I'm going, I wish I'd have gone back and put this all in it. So, but I do have a chapter in there about this whole part of the hijacked brain. And here's what I came up with, and this stays true today. When we drink or use, it has an electrical chemical effect on our brain that creates emotions and feelings. Okay, now we all know emotions, two basic emotions, love and fear. They don't work well in the same compartment. Either you're living in love or you're living in fear each moment of your life. Now, most of us jump back and forth. I wake up in the morning, I always wake up in fear. That's just who I am. I wake up, I usually have a bad dream that I got to think about. I think my kids are taking advantage of me. My wife probably doesn't love me as much as she did yesterday. My boss at work is a real jerk. Those people over Sovereign, they haven't called me in for a couple of weeks, so they don't like me anymore. Blah, 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 blah. That's my old brain starting to work, right? Before I come in today, I sat down and did a meditation. I cleared my chakras. And for a little while, I was living totally in love. Until my wife called me from work and told me one of the people didn't show up one day. So then I went back down. But we are constantly going between love and fear. Now, feelings is basically is a kind of a subset of emotions. Emotions kind of cover a lot of things. Our dreams, our thoughts, our memory. Feelings are just mad, glad, sad, afraid, ashamed, and hurt, right? And when we sit in process groups with people, we want them to identify. And so we say, how are you feeling today? And they go, I'm tired. That's a condition. How do you feel today? Fine. Well, we all know what fine means, right? I can't say it here. Okay. I'm hungry. No, that's a condition. So we try to get them to identify, and these were the words that were beaten in my head. You have to say one of those 6 words. And you can say as many as you want. But these are just feelings. As an alcohol and drug counselor, do I really care what somebody's feeling that day? No. I care what's behind the feelings. But the people that I work with, their feelings change every 15 seconds, so I'm not really worried about it, right? I'm all pissed off today. The driver, they were yelling at me this morning to get out of bed. Well, get out of bed then. So now, I always think about family members. When you ask a family member their feeling, and I say, think about the person that you love that's the addict or the alcoholic. Are you mad? Hell yes. Are you sad? Yes. Are you afraid? Yes. Are you ashamed? Yes. Are you hurt? Yes. If they love me, why can't they stop, right? What's wrong with this person? But you don't ever hear them say, boy, when I think about that loved one in my life that's an addict or an alcoholic, you hear them say, I'm glad. Now, at least with addiction, there's times when we're glad. When the drug dealer answers the phone, when we walk into the bar, when we get our prescription filled, then we're glad. So the poor family members, they don't ever get to be glad, and at least the addict and the alcoholic gets short times where they're going, oh yeah, I really scored today. So, but emotions and feelings become familiar, and familiar repeated means that the neural pathways and the neurons fire together, they wire together. And those repeated long enough with the chemical addiction become addicted. And the 60,000 down here the day that we talk about, that's the number of thoughts we have a day. Now, we've already kind of been talking about this, about the thoughts of drinking and using, but thoughts also create electrical chemical actions in the brain that, when repeated, create neurocircuits. Now, they're not as profound as taking a hit off that meth pipe, or shooting up some heroin, or even having a drink of alcohol. But they're repeated so often, they create neurocircuits in the brain just like the addiction itself. And these maladaptive neurocircuits instigate what I call deceptive brain messages. Deceptive brain messages create, or basically cravings, urges, and our triggers. We call that stinking thinking in AA, right? And repeated deceptive brain messages cause cognitive distortion. I call that a twisted perception of reality. I love to say that because I say that to the guys I work with that we don't have the same political views, and I'll say, you just have a twisted perception of reality. And they go, what's he mean by that? So neurocircuits are responsible for change decision making. Oh, this is my prize graphic. And this is the basic addiction neurocircuitry. The ventral tegmental area, which I talked about before, it sends a signal to the nucleus accumbens. Now, what do the nucleus accumbens do in the brain? It makes everything better. It makes music sound better. It makes flowers smell better. And most of all, it makes sex and drugs feel better. So this releases some dopamine, maybe a few other neurotransmitters. When it gets here, you get a big dump of serotonin and dopamine and other neurotransmitters. It sends a signal up to the thalamus, which is a major highway in the brain. So that, in some ways, all areas of the brain are affected somewhat by addiction, by alcohol or drug use, because it sends signals here that kind of send it to all areas of the brain. And that's why the thalamus will take the signal down to the cerebellum. You drink enough alcohol, and you stumble and you fall down. It sends messages up to the parietal lobe, and you can't move your mouth as well when you talk, and so you slur your words and you say stupid things, and the judgment part of your brain is right in there. It gets all diluted, and we have bad judgment, and it sends messages to the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of the brain here. Now, the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that sends messages through what's called the fasciculus retroflexus. I only say that once. And there are about 250 elongated nerve cells that send messages from the frontal lobe back to the midbrain and says, hey, behave yourself. I know you saw that pretty girl on the street and you want to go up and just grab her and start making out with her, but there's consequences to that. Number one, you might hurt her feelings. Sometimes that doesn't mean much to people. So the next one is you could get arrested. The next one is she may beat the crap out of you, right? So it sends these messages back for our brain to tell our mind to behave ourselves. But what happens with alcohol and drug use? To the fasciculus retroflexus, I lied, I said it twice. Long-term alcohol use will start destroying those cells, usually years. Heroin, cocaine, over months, a lot of usage will destroy it. One night of smoking methamphetamine can wipe out 95% of those cells. Thus, a methamphetamine addict will think nothing of going into a convenience store and blowing away a little lady clerk working at midnight for $50 to go buy some more meth. They'll go do the meth. They won't even think about it. Total lack of emotion towards another human being until they wake up in prison 6 months later and they're going, and their brain's starting to heal, and they're going, holy God, how could I have done that? Same way, how could an Air Force officer with years of training and love aviation and love people, how could I snort cocaine and then a couple days later, or smoke crack and a couple days later go fly an airplane? Cognitive distortion. Okay, some other areas of the brain there. The amygdala, it's right in here, the brain. I don't know where I got it up here, but it's 2 almond-sized glands in the brain, and they have to do with emotional process. And there's a correlation between a small amygdala and a lack of emotion. And as I say, as in CEOs and sociopaths, sorry, Dr. Sharma, it's not meant to be personal, but a lot of times CEOs have no problem at all walking into a corporation and firing a whole bunch of people or stealing a whole bunch of pensions. Or most airline CEOs, they're not too bright to begin with. I mean, they're not only ruthless and heartless, they're not real, they don't even have justification sometimes. So there is and sociopaths will kill you without thinking about it. So there's a lack of emotion. Maybe this is also associated with binge drinking, and that was just supposed to be a political statement that really, I'm sorry. The hippocampus sends and retrieves messages from memory for spatial navigation. It's also associated with Alzheimer's. It's tied to euphoric recall. Hippocampus processes information. One of the things it does very well is it processes euphoric recall. When the addict and the alcoholic, or they wake up in the morning and they're really hungover and they're laying in a puddle of puke and they got arrested the night before and they go, I'm never going to drink again. Right? And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the old hippocampus starts kicking in and sending messages. It'll be different this time. You can just drink a little. Just get a half a gram of Coke. Just take a couple pills. And they're back at it again. So they forget the negative parts and are able to recall the really good parts of getting high. The other thing about the amygdala and the hippocampus, they're both decreased a lot with marijuana use. As is the synapse, that's 1/260 millionth of an inch between the neurons, those start to widen with long-term cannabis use. So if you're on the marijuana maintenance program, it is addictive and it does slow you down. This is how we understand Cheech and Chong, right? They are slower. I've had phone calls from 55-year-old men who've been smoking pot for the last 30 years that said, I can't get out of bed without lighting a joint. Okay, so that was the same as this. I use that a lot in the 3-hour presentation. We can go on behind it. Deceptive brain message is a thought or an urge or desire that leads to an uncomfortable sensation. Negative emotion or craving, which leads to habitual response, drinking, using, negative self-talk, self-pity, binging, or codependent behavior. False brain messages become so ingrained they provide a sense of comfort, familiarity, okay? And the result is this cognitive distortion. Oh, and by the way, not all CEOs have small amygdalas. That just came to me. I was hoping that didn't come off the wrong way, but some do. Airline CEOs, I should have said that. So, sorry. Okay. Cognitive distortion. Remember the 60,000 thoughts that we have a day. How many of your thoughts, and I like everybody to think about it, how many of your thoughts are cognitively distorted? Do you have any of these examples? Do you have any black and white thinking going on? If you're a member of either political party, you probably do, right? Especially, okay. Overgeneralization. Automatically thinking the worst, negative filtering, discounting the positive, magnifying, minimizing, unrealistic comparison, believing that your thoughts are always true, and denial of reality. This is where I usually go into a whole bunch about denial, and actually my wife is just a real expert in denial. She went to that Terry Gorski week-long course on denial, and it's just incredible what she learned there. So, other chemicals affecting thinking. Testosterone, we know that's a male hormone, and it makes us more aggressive. And men have about 8 to 10 times as much testosterone as women do. Women have estrogen, and men get it too, but it's kind of the same proportion. And it also has to do with sex drive in both. Oxytocin is one I like to talk about a lot, because this actually has a correlation with the small amygdala theory, in that some people don't release oxytocin, and it's called the moral molecule. Now, oxytocin has a very short half-life. And it's released when a woman has a baby. She releases a lot of oxytocin, and it's only in mammals, and it helps the mother nurture the baby. Now, I had a sister who had this, what do they call it, postpartum depression. She didn't want anything to do with the baby. Chances are she didn't release any oxytocin. And something that causes you that much pain, you might have a little resentment towards if you don't have some kind of chemical to help you out. Okay. It's also released during orgasms and hugs, 8 per day prescribed. That's 8 hugs a day prescribed. I just caught that this morning when I was looking through my notes. Unless you're 19 years old, it's okay. And we all remember being 19, so okay. It's mostly released in the hypothalamus. It's also released in the blood. And you can't take it orally. and they can synthesize it, but you have to take it in a nasal spray, and it will only make you feel good for a couple seconds. Okay, cortisol. This is kind of, all the chemicals in our body have a purpose, and cortisol is released. It's produced by the adrenaline gland and regulated by the hypothalamus, and it increases blood sugar, because when we get stressed, we need some more blood sugar to try to help our way through it. But there's a lot of negative consequences to cortisol, and this is talked about a lot. It suppresses our immune system. It damages the hippocampus, which destroys memory. It stimulates excessive gastric secretions. It induces collagen, which is a structural protein in the skin. So if you're like me and worried about all your wrinkles, it's not good to have stress. It's a diuretic, and it inhibits sodium loss. It increases blood pressure, and it harms the reproductive system. Caffeine may increase cortisol levels, so I only did 2 espressos this morning. Love, sex, and intimacy. This is all part of the brain structure too, and that when we're in love, the romantic type, it is also fires the ventral tegmental area. Now, when I say the romantic type, I mean the 6 month to 1 year romantic type, when that person walks in the room and you just feel warm and fuzzy all over, and you want to make love with them, but you just want to be with them all their life, and they're just the greatest thing that's ever happened. Everything they say is funny. You don't care that they smoke, and you don't like the smell of cigarette smoke. You don't care that they have other bad habits, because they just turn you on, right? The pheromones are just all fired up and everything. And then, over time, though, we build up an immunity to them, and so that type of romantic thing sometimes doesn't last unless we have long-term intimacy. And that's another area of the brain. It's actually right in here, the ventral pallidum, and that's associated with, it's fired in your brain with people that have been married for 30 years. And she walks in the room. Probably don't think about sex right away, but they think about, oh, I'm glad she's here. I feel good. She lights up my room. That's why people have a long-term relationship. It activates a different area of the brain. Now, the hypothalamus sends signals to release testosterone and estrogen, and that's just all about sex. So they actually have 3 different things. You have drive for sex, the drive for romance, and then the drive for total intimacy. And I think it's good to understand that the brain really does distinguish the 3. And also, when it comes to sex addiction, I just love the courses I've taken on this. Sexual addiction has nothing about a high libido or fetishes or anything like that. It has to do with, does the person have negative consequences as a result of obsessive thoughts, destructive behavior. So just because somebody seems to be really horny to you doesn't mean they have a sexual addiction, okay? That's my story, I'm sticking with it. Okay, and these all have areas in the brain. This is kind of correlates with, here's the ventral tegmental area, and the main neurocircuit goes to the nucleus accumbens, as it shows you right here. Blue is dopamine. It releases dopamine. That's the main reward system of the brain. But these other things I'm talking about, the ventral pallidum and things, they release glutamate and GABA, and everything's tied to the hippocampus. So it all ties together, and we don't have time to go into that much more than that. How are we doing time-wise? I think I'm going to skip neurofeedback, other than to say it's a non-invasive thing for the brain. You put a couple electrodes on your head, it measures your brain waves, and then gives you some kind of a feedback, either audio or visual or both. And it's meant to re-regulate your brain, make you feel calm and alert. And there's different protocols for it. Lori and I got certified in it years ago, but the equipment we have is too old, so we don't actually do it ourselves with clients at our place, but we do believe in it. And if you remember the hijacked brain graphic there, on the bottom left there was a green box that had the electrical brainwave state. And basically our brainwaves are measured in hertz, which is a cycle per second, and when we're sleeping you can see that there's 1, 2, 3 cycles there, and that goes with the delta brain waves. The theta, that's a meditative state, and then alpha is the calm state. So a lot of treatment in EEG neurofeedback, and a lot of things that we try to do with people to get them to meditate, is to put them in an alpha theta state. We're kind of half awake, half asleep. We're not totally conscious, but that's when we get a lot of healing in the brain, and we actually get a lot of insight. SMR is also known as low beta. That's our normal brain consciousness. I just bring this up because, like I said, this is 1 second here. This is probably about 16 across here cycles. And what we want to see with an EEG when you're measuring low beta only, or SMR waves, is that. It goes all the way amplitude. That means the person is present, they're awake, they're alive, they're feeling things. If they're going real high, it means they're a little overexcited. If you run into brain waves like this, which is what my brain waves look like, by the way, when I measure my low beta, it's a sign of attention deficit, called tired brain. Thus the reason that people who have attention deficit problems do things all the time to try to excite their brain. Okay? You know, that's why they do have, you know, the kid in class that's disruptive behavior all the time. He's just trying to keep his brain awake. Also, people that get them addicted, they usually end up liking stimulants because it makes them feel more awake, more alive. Probably the reason I like talking in front of people, because I have to wake up and be present for a little bit, and then I'll go home and, you know, be back to my tired brain. Also, the gamma waves, this is when our brain really kicks into gear. And that's when, as Sherry Corbett said when she did her presentation here, that's when we have aha moments. That's when we've been trying to figure something out, and all of a sudden it all ties together. I always say it's also what I feel when I'm landing a 747 on a dark night, and I'm low on fuel, and maybe the gusty winds, and I'm really focused for that last 3 minutes of the flight, of being right straight down the course, right straight on the glide slope perfectly, and right at the exact airspeed. You know, and I'm just really, really focused. And once we get off the runway, I kind of go, whoa, I got to be very careful because we got to still get the airplane to the gate without hitting anything. So, you know, it's kind of what pilots do, especially pilots with attention deficit problem, which a lot of us do. We go into what they call super focus mode, and that's when you kick your brain into gamma state. Okay, enough of that. Here's how we change our mind. We use our mind to change our brain, I should say. We recognize the thought. When we have a thought, we recognize, we go, there I go again. I am not defined by my thoughts, is what I have to say to myself. And these are things that I use. I relabel the message. First of all, is it true or false? Well, I go, no, it's false. So I relabel it. I tap myself in the head, and I usually say, that's bullshit. Seems to be a good word to work for me. You know, but I'm from Ohio, so we're a little backwards there. Reframe. Review the content of the thought. Is it I can't or I won't? Now, I do this a lot when I'm working with people. I say, hey, have you gone to a meeting today? Well, I can't go to a meeting today. Well, why not? Well, I don't have the time. I say, is that you don't have the time or you won't make the time? I don't know. I work a lot. And I still find time to go to AA. So I never buy that. You know, when the guy's living in a sober living home and he's maybe working 10 hours a week max and says, I don't have time to go to meetings. So, refocus. Focus on the truth, the big picture, gratitude. We can always switch everybody over when you're working in recovery. What do you have to be grateful for today? I know your day went to crap, but what do you have to be grateful for today? If you can't find something, you know, put a mirror under your nose. You still got some fog there. That's, you know, that's something to be grateful for. Sometimes we have to get really basic. Reevaluate. What's a better course of action? Consequences, long-term effects. So evaluate everything with our thoughts. What we try to do is get the people to think about, before they call their drug dealer, before they stop in the bar, you know, reevaluate your thoughts. And repetition. All this stuff that we do in recovery, which I'll cover kind of all that. Practice those things. You've got to be prepared. And it's like people that have anger problems. People that have anger problems, the counselors will say, well, pause. Well, here's what I find out. I say, can you pause when somebody cuts you off on the freeway and then flips you off? They go, no, I want to kill that person. I go, no, you don't want to do that. And they go, I can't help it. So what I finally realized is that what they did the day before and the day before and the day before gives them the spiritual and the conscious awareness to go, that person flipped me off, person cut me off, flipped me off, it's okay. But it takes working ahead of time. You can't become spiritually fit right in the moment if you haven't been preparing for it on a daily basis. If we're doing these things, this is called self-directed neuroplasticity. We have the ability to change how our brain adapts. This guy wrote this book, Evolve Your Brain, Joe Dispenza. These are the 4 things that he came up with. People that had spontaneous remission from terminal diseases. One is they believed in a divine awareness, and or divine intelligence, AA, we call it a higher power. It basically has to do with steps 1, 2, and 3. Number 2, change their belief systems. I work with people, I tell them to challenge everything you were taught to believe, all your belief systems, because that's what I had to do in my recovery. I had to challenge what I was taught in my religion, because my religion already told me I was going to burn in hell. It's over. Game over. You've already done it all. Stereotypes, what I thought about other people. I actually had to look at my political views and actually change them 180 degrees when I finally listened to the other side. Outlook on life, most importantly, our own self-worth. See, we run into a lot of people in Orange County that feel entitled, and they feel they deserve everything given to them, but they have no self-worth. Well, there's a correlation there, right? So we want to create a sense of self-worth and build self-esteem in people. We want to create personal boundaries based on your personal values. So you have to identify what your personal values are. I have one personal boundary that I live by. I choose to be around sober people in sober environments. Personal boundary. It's about me and only me. It has nothing to do if my friend Chris wants to go drink tonight. That's okay. You go drink all you want. I just choose not to go with you. Right? It's concise. It's written in the positive. I didn't say I ain't going to drink. I ain't going to use. It doesn't say have any negative words in it. It's written in sober words. It's concise. It's positive. And it's flexible. Am I ever around people in a drinking environment? Of course. I go to weddings. I go to funerals. I go to family events. I go to ball games. You know, people are going to drink. But I'm always prepared when I'm going to be in that situation. I go with the crew down to Australia. I lay over in Australia usually 3 times a month. I'll go down to the bar once in a while or go to the restaurant. And, you know, and people start drinking, and if I get uncomfortable at all, or once I'm done and they're starting to sound silly to me, I just get them to go to the bathroom and I don't come back. And I'm always shocked that nobody missed me. Right? How could this be? I'm always expecting the next day a word to happen to you, and they don't even say that. So, okay. So I always encourage people that I work with to steal that personal boundary, and I think it's a good one for people to have. People who have the spiritual awakening or had a near-death experience or made a decision, like in step 3, to change their lives, they are going to have what we call quantum changes in value shifts. And for men, and when I read this, I almost fell over because this was just about how I was. Before I got into recovery, I was about wealth and adventure. I wanted to travel to everywhere. It was all about pleasure. I wanted to be respected, you know. After and in recovery, and I can say it's pretty much what I want today. I want spirituality. I want personal peace. I want my family. I want to understand God's will for me. I want to be honest. I always thought I was honest over here. Well, when I got arrested, I'm sitting there with just a towel wrapped around me, and the cops start questioning me, and they're just battering me, and I'm going, I'm being honest with you. I'm an honest man. And they started laughing at me, and I thought, well, how dare you? How dare you laugh at me, a crack addict? Right. Women's values, here's how they change. Before recovery or before quantum change, they believed in family, independence, career, fitting room. After, growth, self-esteem, spirituality, happiness. You know, they got honesty down here. It's kind of funny how we have this big shift. That's what we're looking for in recovery, is a shift in values. Instead of my drug dealer being the most important part of my life, instead of my drug being the most important part of my life, maybe having a God of my understanding being an important part of my life. How about the program? How about getting out of myself instead of always thinking about me? Because there's one thing I find with everybody that's depressed, everybody has anxiety, and everybody has addiction. They think of themselves first. The first word out of their mouth is almost always I or me, something to do with me. They rarely do anything outside of themselves. They're so focused on their depression. And that's because their brain has been hijacked that way. So we want to start switching that around. And then we start finding, hey, if I do something for somebody else, I get a reward that I've never felt before. And then all of a sudden that feels good. Maybe I'll do that again. And that's how we create new neural circuits in the brain for recovery. Doing things that are unfamiliar until they become familiar. So we reinvent how we live. These are all the things that we try to teach And what I always try to teach anytime I'm doing groups or working with somebody as an AA sponsor, prayer, meditation, spiritual living, 12-step, diet, nutrition, affirmation, personal boundaries, exercise, volunteer work. Ugh. Boy, do you know how much trouble we have getting people who do nothing all day except come to the 3 hours with us for 3 hours, and we say, why don't you do some volunteer work in the afternoon? Oh, I don't have time to do that. Why don't you go down Charlie Street and see if you can help those guys down there? Why don't you go work with autistic kids? Why don't you go to a nursing home and just talk to old people? No, oh man, I tell you what. And the ones that don't do that are so prone to relapse, it's not even funny. The people that make changes get sober. Okay, last thing here. Long periods lost in time space. That's the last thing that Joseph Esparza said they did. Well, he said, now this is kind of quantum thinking, that our brains are capable of processing 400 billion bits of information per second. But in normal life, we process 2,000 bits of information per second. That's your brain sending 100,000 signals to your heart to beat every day. To pump 100 gallons of blood to your system. It's sending 66 different signals to your liver right now while you're sitting here to do all kinds of different functions. You're digesting your food, so your stomach's secreting acids and enzymes. That all comes automatically. Our blinking, everything we do, and that's in that 2,000 bits of information per second. But what are we aware of? 3 things. We're aware of time. We know it's about time to get the heck out of here. Number 2, we're aware of our environment, and we're aware of how I feel. We're aware of how we feel. Some of you are tired, some of you are bored, some of you are happy, it seems like. So in order to get from that 2,000 bits of information per second to tap into this inner resource that we all have of 400 billion bits of information per second, we have to eliminate these 3 things. We have to get into a state of mind where we're not thinking about how we feel, what time it is, or where we're at. And how do we do that? Anybody got a guess? Meditation, getting that alpha theta state of the brain. Trust me, I have had periods of meditation in my recovery where I start getting answers when I'm sleeping in the bunk, when I get 5 or 6 hours of sleep on the way down to Australia. A lot of times it'll get bumpy and I'll wake up and I'll try to fight it, go back to sleep. Instead, I'll just lay there and I'll go into a meditative state. I actually keep a notebook and a paper with me, because what happens, I don't have a question, but I start getting answers. I start getting solutions to life problems that have bothered me for years. And I'll go, bam, I have those aha moments. I write it down. Sometimes I can't read it the next day, but I try to remember to write it down, without going out of the meditative state. Beware, there's a spiritual awakening ahead. I want people that work the 12 steps, I want them to recognize there is a goal by working the 12 steps. It is in the 12th step. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. There's a goal in mind. Know that. So when you're doing steps 1 through 11, there's something at the end of the rainbow. You're not just doing this to make your sponsor happy. You're doing this because you're going to change how you think and how you perceive life. We went from there February 5th, 1999. I got out of jail, went home and had a bottle of wine. That was the last drink I ever had. I've never touched a drug since then either. And, gifts of recovery. 9 months after my arrest, I was back in the cockpit. I flew, instead of being in prison where I belonged, I flew 400 people from San Francisco to Hawaii in a 747. I actually had tears in my eyes, so I took off over the coast. I couldn't believe I was ever back in the cockpit after getting busted for cocaine. I continue to make living amends with my sons and my family. I met Lori, this fine young lady here, 2003 at an AA meeting. We liked each other so much that not 8 years later, we opened an outpatient facility. And then we liked each other so much, November last year, we got married. I'm very grateful for that. That's the first thing on my gratitude list every day. On February 5th, I celebrated 13 years clean and sober, and this morning I was able to get up and look at myself in the mirror without punching myself, without calling my name, and just make contact in the mirror with my eyes and say, I'm okay. Only one question, how to love this world. Say to yourself what you would be, then do what you have to do. That's our outpatient. So, there we go.
Anybody have any questions for Larry just before we wrap up?
I have one. As far as the meditation you were saying, do you have any quick ways to go into a meditative state when you don't have much time?
You know what I found the best stuff is on YouTube. There's guided meditations on YouTube. If you don't have Dr. Snyder around, to help you through a guided meditation, there's some really good stuff on YouTube. And I do the same thing with the chakra clearing. I've tried it in the groups here and at our place, and it goes over pretty well. Of course, there's a lot of people that are too antsy to even try it, which we understand. Yeah. But there's a lot of really good stuff on there, and there's so much stuff on the internet. And I try different things at different times. Okay. I try laying down when I do it. I go to a yoga class that we do a 10-minute meditation before and 10 minutes after. And I usually get pretty deep into it in those circumstances. I have never gone into the states where I've meditated for like an hour in a row, which I would really like to be able to get there, but I still got a little too busy of craziness up here.
So just to quickly repeat the question, it was, what are the ways and sources you can find meditation? And Larry was just answering that question. YouTube, yoga, mindfulness. So any other questions? Sure, Marcia?
Earlier you had said that addiction points to the brain and recovery points to spirituality. And so I was talking about the brain. And I still, at 21 years of recovery myself, can never peg who's going to make it and who's not going to make it.
That's absolutely
so I was wondering if there was any brain study done on what makes it possible for recovery, or if it really is a matter of willingness or just behavior thing, or,
Well, everybody's willing at some point in time, right? And it's a lot of accountability. Pilots have a 92% long-term recovery rate, and even of that 92, less than 10% of that 92 ever relapse. So 85% have long-term recovery rate the first time. And so they said, well, why do pilots different? Well, I'm going to tell you, it isn't because they get in touch with their emotions very easily. Because most of these guys are ex-military, and most of them, they know how to read checklists, but they don't know how, and they tell their family we're going to be at the car at 0800 in the morning to go on vacation, and they're sitting there at 0800 by themselves, and everybody else is in the house because they don't know how to relate to people very well. They don't understand why people don't follow their orders. I mean, they do in the airplane. But what they do find is that they're accountable. They're held accountable. I was monitored for 5 years. I had to go to aftercare once a week for 5 years. I had to see a psychiatrist every year. I had to see a medical doctor every month. I had to see my boss every month. I had to see EAP people and pilot peer reps every month. And so there's a lot of accountability, really helps. And I love alcohol and drug testing. I think it's the best thing that's ever come down because I've never seen anybody that was clean and sober that ever had a problem doing it. And we usually don't have to do it because Lori looks them in the eye and goes, before you go do this, is there anything you'd like to tell me? We don't even have to spend the money on the test because they just, I did everything. So, yes, and John, you have a question.
Quickly, let me just repeat that last question just so the audience who's watching online can know what we were discussing. The question was, how can we determine if somebody will be successful in their recovery? Are there any studies that are done? And one of the things is the airline pilot studies do show a percentage of, what is the percentage? It's over
92%.
92% of 5-year monitoring. And as far as brain scanning, I know that there are many studies right now underway doing brain spec and looking at people's.
And AA has the other solution to that is, people, if they can be totally honest with themselves. And the people that can't be totally honest with themselves can't get it. And you got to really look at yourself and say really what I am. But and do that without beating yourself up so much and start living in shame so much, because a lot of the people we work with have so much shame that if you don't get them through that, then they're going to relapse even no matter what their motivation is.
Right.
It's more a comment than a question, but as I'm sure, Larry, a lot of the heavy pot smokers, hash smokers, and so on, have a very high degree of denial about the addictive qualities of marijuana and cannabis, and many times they'll say, well, it enlightens me, it makes me more creative, I'm a musician, I'm a this, I'm a that, and one thing I always point out to them, I say, they don't call it dope for nothing. And they look at me like, what do you mean dope? Just think about the word dope. It's not enlightening you, it's dumbing you down. And that's a cognitive distortion as well. But it's a fault that we have in this profession too, that many times with marijuana, it's minimized. It's considered kind of the potato chip drug of the whole menu of drugs, and it's not that big a deal, and so on and so forth. And I would just suggest that it's an extremely dangerous drug in the brains of the wrong people, and it should be addressed along with all addictions.
All right, and I totally agree with you. And what I do when they tell me that creative crap, I get out the list of all the dead musicians. And I got this idea. I was in Dr. O'Connor's office, who used to be president of Betty Ford one day, and he had just lost his nephew, who is Carol O'Connor's son, to drug addiction. And he had a list of all the really super musicians and actors and actresses who had died from addiction. So I'll say, you know, I'm not going to argue with you that it makes you more creative, but do you want to be uncreative and alive, or do you want to be creative and dead? It's your choice.
One thing, as a matter of fact, real quick, that I give them an analogy. I say, you ever flown on a jet plane? Oh yeah, of course I have. I say, well, if you were to get on a jet plane and the door of the cockpit happened to swing open, and the pilots are in there passing the joint back and forth or smoking a bong or something, I said, you wouldn't feel a little bit nervous about being on that plane?
Yeah.
No, I never thought about that. You know, so.
In fact, I'm meeting tomorrow with a JetBlue pilot who just got fired for smoking marijuana. Yeah. He busted the test, and JetBlue, what we're going to try to do is, first of all, get him back to flying. He's really doing well in recovery, but we're also going to try to convince JetBlue to institute what we call the HIMSS program, which is a Human Intervention Motivation Study. It was started in 1972. Dr. Pursch was a very big part of that, who was my psychiatrist, and it's to get pilots with addiction problems back in the cockpit. And we want them, the reason is we want them to self-disclose. We want them to come in and say, hey, I've got a problem, without getting fired. Because right now, if a pilot comes in, or at JetBlue, if he would have admitted it, that he had a problem, he wanted to get treatment, they would have fired him. So.
All right, everyone, thank you for coming. I just wanted to quickly do the raffle. I know everyone has to get back to probably their offices, and so quickly.
If Lori's card comes out, I apologize. Oh.
Marsha with the Pax House. She actually just walked out, so I'll have to go and catch her. But again, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Larry.
Appreciate it. Well, thank you, dear.